Alexandria Archive Institute / Open Context video, I'll explain how to ensure that you have a question for your project. While we learn how to ask questions at an early age, sometimes when we start doing science, particularly cool ones like archaeology, the cool things that we can do get in the way of making sure that we're actually using those methods to answer a question. In archaeology, we use a lot of cool methods to create and share data. We do that, though, because we want to explore questions about the past. And sometimes using innovative methods to create high-quality datasets is important, even if we don't have a question, such as in the case of archaeological sites that are threatened by climate change. But most of the time, we need to be clear about why we're using that method to create data, and a question helps clarify that process. In addition, if we want to reuse existing data or help people in the future reuse our data, understanding the process of data creation, such as what research question inspired it or what methods created it, can help people better evaluate what new questions they can ask by providing context for that data's creation in the first place. So, what is a question? A question is, quote, a worded or expressed sentence, phrase, or only a word on its own, which asks for information, a reply, or a response, at least according to Wiktionary. In terms of science, a question is usually the thing we pose that our hypotheses answer. In this case, a hypothesis is then a statement of one possible answer that can then, through analyses, be disproven. Now that we've refreshed in our minds what questions are, let's go through a few other tests to see if you've got one for your project. Does your phrase start with words like does, who, what, when, where, why, or how? If not, see if you can rephrase it to start with one of those words. These are a helpful indication that you are posing a question rather than making a statement or asserting something that you'd like to do. Another way to assess this is, does the phrase end in a question mark? AKA, does it go up at the end? If you can't state your potential question in a way where it makes sense for it to end in a question mark, or adding a questioning tone at the end makes it sound weird, then you might not have a question. Reassess your potential question until it can end in a question mark, or until adding a questioning tone makes it sound like you're asking something rather than just feeling unsure about your statement. Now that you've got a question, or have a handle on how they work so you can write one later, we're going to move on and focus on posing small questions in relation to a specific dataset. These questions are all based on the dataset Aggregative Series-Book Data, which is the dataset we created to go along with our Aggregative Series digital data stories. You can learn more about the content from the books and those data stories in the other videos on the Alexandria Archive Institute / Open Context YouTube channel, or explore them directly through the Digital Data Stories webpage. Looking at this dataset, there are a lot of column headings that you could use to ask and potentially answer questions. You can even combine a couple to answer more complex questions, for example, seeing if publication year influenced the length of a particular book. However, it's also a messy data set with some gaps in the data and spots where there's a lot of information crammed into just one box. These columns might make it difficult to answer and pose a small question, so it's best to avoid those for now. Instead, focus on clean columns that deal with concepts that you're familiar with and that have enough observations for you to be able to answer a question. Here are some of the questions I came up with after exploring these data. As I list them out, consider which column headings you've seen in our screen recording that would be best suited to answering them. Who created the content warning lists included for these books? What is the average length of a book in this list? When were the books recommended in this list published? Where were the authors who wrote these books from? How many books belong in each theme? While not all of these questions are strictly archaeological, they do help us practice how to pose questions even for such a small data set. In addition, many of these can be adapted to fit real archaeological data. As a practice, find a dataset on Open Context and rewrite some of the questions I suggested in a way that makes sense for the data that you found. Remember, think in terms of structure rather than content. For example, the dataset you found might not include a column on nationality, but it might have a column where the possible choices in it have a similar number of options as nationality. These are a reminder that while questions do aim to answer something specific, the practice of making or posing a question is more about structure than content. Now that you've gotten a refresher on what questions are, how to test whether you have a question, seen how to explore data, and looked at that data in relation to answerable questions, I hope you feel prepared to pose some answerable questions based on your own or another existing data set. If you want to learn more about how to read and clean data, check out our video on OpenRefine or explore our other videos for information on a variety of other archaeology and data-related topics. Or navigate over to our website to get tutorials for things like how to search Open Context. you.